I could feel the reign of terror spiraling. US historian and Yale professor Marci Shore and her husband, world-renowned historian Timothy Snyder, as well as their other colleagues, are leaving Trump's America for good. The other topic, Trump's tariffs, may hit US defense production. Let's also discuss that. And we also discuss the tariffs with someone who surely knows the whole thing, Anastasia Feduk. He's an assistant professor of finance at the Haas School of Business and University of Berkeley. So, good afternoon. My name is Henry Caine, and we are UATV English, an English-speaking Ukrainian state media in constant persuasion to deliver hard truth in easy terms for the whole free world directly from Ukraine. Amidst the old mayhem and turmoil created by Donald Trump's second presidency, 3 Yale University professors last week announced they would be leaving the US for Canada over concerns about the increasingly authoritarian direction their country is heading in.
I could feel the reign of terror spiraling. My impulse was to take my kids and get out of the situation that seemed very dark and very frightening to me. Historian Marci Shore, in an interview to the Kyiv Independent.
Marci Shore, along with her husband Timothy Snyder and colleague Jason Stanley, are leaving their post at Yale University to teach at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. All 3 have been vocal pro-Ukraine advocates, particularly throughout Russia's full-scale invasion, visiting the country multiple times. Between them and educating audiences in the US with what they've learned. The Kyiv Independent spoke to Shore to find out what made them take such a drastic, indeed, decision. I sincerely advise you on that interview. It is a great piece of journalism. But I wanted to talk about something else today. I wanted to talk about how one crazy lunatic, right-wing conspiracy theorist, Laura Loomer, who recently called for Trump to fire national security staffers, 6 of them. And Trump did. Just like that. Again, a conspiracy theorist calls for the President of the United States of America to do whatever the hell a conspiracy theorist wants, and Trump does exactly that. Simple as that. And that reminds me of, Vladimir Putin acts in the same way, by the way. Sure, Putin is way further down into the abyss of tyranny, so he simply murders anyone he sees as potential threats. But no worries, just give Trump a couple of terms more, and he already said he's ready for that, and America will be there. With all the attributes like fake ballots, murdered political opponents, wars and tortures, and a constitution disfigured to prostitution, once a manifest of the freedom of them, the people, then a manifest of loyalty to the one who has amended it to their favor. America is becoming Russia, a country of morbid national narcissism and arrogant self-admiration, a country of ignorance, flaunting itself and ridiculing intelligence, a country of influential anti-vaxxers and conspiracy theorists instead of scientists and doctors, a country of world-renowned professors running away from tyranny while still can. America is becoming Russia, a country of the cult of mediocrity, baseness, meanness, and arrogant bourgeois fascism that is tossed to the uneducated, unhinged social masses under the disguise of false patriotism, so they can dwell safely in an artificial imaginary greatness while their Tsar is waging genocidal wars. America is becoming Russia faster than you think. Whoever criticizes Trump, whoever doubts his authority, intellect, righteousness, ethics, morality, that is literally everything that Donald Trump obviously does not possess, they are doomed in his America. Yes, in his America. It's his by now. His and a pack of venture vultures like Elon Musk. Today, Trump fires 6 national security professionals because a conspiracy theorist demands so. Timothy Snyder and his wife Marci Shore and their lead of Yale leaves America. But this is all good news for Trump, right? He needs no brains and no opposition, just as it is the case with Putin. Intellect-based dignity and the grace of human values are not valued in Trump's America. It's oil value, deals valor, ventures dignity, joint stock morality, money grace, just as it is the case in Russia. There's no higher virtue for Trump than loyalty to Trump, and no higher misdemeanor than criticism towards him, just as it is the case with Putin. Trump's ego is not just delicate, it's psychopathically fragile, just as Putin's is. They are two morbid narcissists, two black holes with nothing but a catastrophic collision on the global events horizon. Both unpredictable, unreliable, dehumanized, vindictive, arrogant, and negligent. Trump and his pack, Putin and his entourage, are both representing the epitome of tyrannical values, system where unquestionable loyalty is a profession and highly valued expertise, and criticism is a high crime and a treason. Well, we in Ukraine may be at war, yes, but we are better off than America, as we are aware of the clear and present danger. We are at war against tyranny, right now, right here. And America just as well is at war against tyranny. It just refuses to believe it, for now. Tariffs imposed by US President Donald Trump could seriously hit the United States defense industry, complicating international cooperation and increasing the cost of manufacturing military equipment. Political reports on that in April 4th. Trump unveiled a sweeping list of reciprocal tariffs on April 2nd, imposing a baseline 10% duty on all countries, including Ukraine, with even higher rates for major trade partners like the European Union. Russia and Belarus were not included on the list, and the tariffs could undermine international defense cooperation by jeopardizing joint military projects, including producing the F-35 fighter jet, air defense systems, and constructing nuclear submarines. There's going to be shortages of supplies, tit for tats, and our allies and other partners are going to retaliate, said Bill Greenwald, a former Pentagon acquisition official. Some potentially vital supplies are either going to cost a whole heck of a lot more than what they did, or they're just not going to be available, he added. The Pentagon has spent decades building, financing, and developing a global network of suppliers and companies, many of which are now facing tariffs. Without defense exemptions, the administration could negate much of that work, delaying the production of US-made weapons for the country and other buyers. We count on the US for the best equipment, the European official said. European industrial capacity has greatly improved, and we want to be security providers, not just consumers. This means investing more in European production to reduce dependence on American spare parts and materials for weapons, the official added. Senator Mark Kelly, a senior Senate Armed Services member whose state won more than $14.5 billion in U.S. Defense Department contracts last year, highlighted the complexity of defense production and noted that due to the new tariffs, the products of the U.S. military industry may repeatedly be subject to duties during the production process. The prices are going to go up, and the prices that the U.S. Defense Department has to pay are going to go up, Kelly said. Our defense budget, if we want to maintain the same type of force, will get more expensive. Earlier, Ukrainian Economy Minister Yulia Svirdenko said that the Trump administration's latest tariffs are likely to be difficult but not critical for Ukraine's economy. Well, let's ask someone who surely knows the thing. Anastasia Fedek is Ukrainian and an assistant professor of finance at the Haas School of Business at US Berkeley. And we welcome you, Anastasia. Thank you so very much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, sure. Well, wow, Trump's tariffs. This is already causing a huge, how shall I put it, effect on world stock markets around the globe, to put it mildly. But Trump dubs it as the Liberation Day. I'm struggling to understand a liberation from what exactly it is and what is an impact on the United States of America. Any effect yet on the domestic stock markets and consumer prices, by the way, in the United States?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, liberation is a term that sometimes gets used very oddly. Um, Indeed, the U.S. stock market was down substantially yesterday. It's down again at open today, and of course, global markets are responding negatively as well.
Right.
I mean, a tariff is ultimately a tax. So now the US government is going to tax imports of goods from other countries into the US by a larger amount than they were doing before. And of course, what that means is that the prices will rise for the firms that are buying those products, intermediate parts and goods, or for consumers who are buying directly from abroad.
Right.
So the government is raising revenue that way, but it's at the expense of U.S. businesses, U.S. consumers, and of course will impact the actions taken by U.S. businesses and U.S. consumers who are likely going to slow down their consumption of those goods. So the U.S. businesses may well slow down their own production in certain sectors if they're now having more trouble purchasing the parts, for example, from abroad.
Well, on a scale from 1 to 10, how far do you think American economy is from recession due to that new trade policy, whatever it is?
That's a difficult thing to assess from the get-go.
Right.
So, in general, the U.S. economy has been pretty healthy recently. Of course, a few years ago, inflation was high. That's come down. The U.S. Federal Reserve has been sort of modulating the rates down, keeping recession down. And now that that's gotten under control, the rates have started to go down. The U.S. economy has been growing healthily, I would say. The jobs have been kind of increasing in general in recent years. So it was in a good state. So it's not as precarious starting out. That said, this is a pretty substantial shock. Now, of course, we also are all kind of waiting to see how it develops, whether any of it maybe is backtracked from. But I think the risks of the recession, subjectively speaking, by certain analysts, for example, JP Morgan, issued their reports and then maybe put up that from kind of 40% to 60% over some horizon. So it's not imminent, but definitely more likely than it was.
Right. Well, let's go global, shall we? United States tariffs obviously impacting international trade, both in short and long term. My question is, how you think this is going to happen? How exactly?
Yeah, so of course, a lot of those are meant to hit straight away. There's a little bit of actually confusion and uncertainty exactly, right?
Right.
Sort of how and and where and when they get imposed.
I
There
bet.
was a little bit of confusion even in the tariffs themselves, in terms of which regions that they were impacting, Australia and things like that. So a little bit of uncertainty, but generally, I think an expectation of pretty swift impact, so pretty swift rise in tariffs. Of course, we're kind of seeing some precautionary reactions. I think European
Right.
wines have
Right.
been increasing in their sales in the U.S. in the last months or so, as people were anticipating tariffs on Europe. Similarly with cars, I think a lot of people who were thinking about a car expedited that
Exactly. You're
decision,
just
purchased early.
reading my thoughts. Yeah. I would like to just go buy myself a new
Yeah, so a
car
bit of
now.
a Exactly, a bit of a reallocation. That so people who were planning to buy it maybe bought earlier, of course. But that means, in the short term, is that that's going to slow down the sales once it hits, right? So, already, right, people kind of expedited their process. So, in terms of impact on the other countries, now, of course, those are basically being hit with export tariffs. So when they are selling a good into the US, now there is a tax on that sale. What does it mean? That means that they will potentially raise prices, right? And that's what's going to impact US consumers and firms paying more for it. They are likely also going to sell less to the US. So for countries like China, there is a
Right.
lot of potential for even more Chinese-made goods to be flowing to, for example, EU instead of US, because that tariff is one of the largest, right? It's over 50% now when we combine it with the previous 20% tariff that was already on China. So there's going to be also a network effect across the global economy in terms of who's trading with whom as a result of it being more expensive, especially for some countries to trade with the US.
So everything will grow in price. That's one thing that we can tell. Like, I'm not professional in finance, but tariff is pretty much what it does to prices. But Anastasia, what's next, do you think? I mean, I'm not even asking why. I can get it, or guess, but what's next? A new wave of protectionism? So tariffs and more tariffs on top of it is... What should we expect? I know you don't have an answer, but I'm just, frustrating to know what could be next. It's just interesting. Let's speculate.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, right, this is quite unilateral, right? So the tariffs imposed by the US, now they apply to almost all of the globe, but they're unilateral, but the US has raised those tariffs. A lot of countries are already discussing, likewise, unilateral responses, so imposing tariffs on US exports. Now, there are some challenges to that, right? So take EU as an example. There's a lot of trade between EU and the US, more slightly larger exports from EU to US than from US to EU, but actually quite substantial on both sides. But for example, one of the main exports from the US to EU is energy, right? And having sanctioned Russian energy,
By the way.
obviously much better reason,
Right.
it's going to be more challenging to, for example, impose a tariff on US energy exports into the EU. So I expect that other countries are going to be a bit more sophisticated in terms of not imposing this blanket tariff of X% on everything,
Right.
because some of it hurts themselves a lot more than others. Right? EU likely will not be imposing things like US energy, but there are other US goods, right? For example, digital goods, a lot of that kind of IT
Yep. Right.
type things, right? That US is sort of the world leader on, and those for sure, I think already, right, EU has some issues with in terms of privacy and other things that EU has stricter, right, standards on than the US.
Right.
So I expect other countries will be more sophisticated in terms of imposing tariffs on goods that will be more likely to have an impact on the US, but will be less likely to hurt their own economy domestically. Now, of course, as you say, in general, more barriers to trade is harmful to both sides because they're not kind of getting the benefit from that trade. Do we think this is the beginning of a new wave of protectionism? I mean, hopefully not in the sense of hopefully other trade relationships, if anything, strengthen, right, in kind of in the presence of this adversarial sort of right approach between US and its trade partners towards each other, presumably at least sort of between US trade partners, right, among each other. It should not be the case, and possibly, right, even kind of make some of that trade more lenient to make it easier to still export to non-US destinations. But we will see.
Oh yeah, exactly. We're already seeing I mean, obviously, there are people I've been talking to them these days, and who say that Trump slams these tariffs to encourage American businesses to move their production sites to Russia. I mean, how crazy is that? I mean, even to imagine, could that be even possible, or this is just impossible?
You don't want to say impossible with I guess the Trump administration, because many things happened that we thought were
Exactly. I
unlikely.
mean,
But I would say very unlikely. I mean, his
highly likely.
for sure his stated aim is to encourage those businesses to produce more inside the U.S. Russia, of course, was not on the tariff list, which was odd, to be honest. The stated reason was that trade with Russia was very low. It's true that it's very low compared to a few years ago, but it is not low to, for example, trade with even Ukraine, let alone, right, some smaller countries like Mauritius. So I think the real potential, perhaps the real reason, is that trade with Russia is very low in terms of Russian exports. So very low in terms of
Right,
US
right, right, right.
exports into Russia. It is still kind of in the single digit billion state for Russian exports into the US. And why? Because those were specifically exempt from sanctions. So those are some agriculture products, some metals, so things that you're sort of strategically exempted from sanctions in the last, I guess 3 or 11 even years. And so I think if they did, they applied basically this formula, or this ad hoc formula to calculate the tariff on each country, where they took the difference between the imports and exports and divided that by one side and then divided by two. And in the case of Russia, that would be a very, very large number because US is not supposedly, right, selling into Russia. Now they sometimes sell to third countries that then sell to Russia, but it's not selling directly, sort of exporting directly into Russia, but they are importing from Russia these exempted categories. And so I think if you apply the formula, it will look very large. And so they decided just not to even do it for now. Now, of course, that is concerning because there is a stated intention to resume more trade with Russia. And then it will sort of become a precedent, right, or a default that the tariff is not high. So for sure, there is concern, I think, among many of us about the plans for trade with Russia. I don't quite think that's the main rationale for the tariffs that he's setting elsewhere.
I mean, in the end of any of your answers, which are perfect, and your expertise is amazing, we can just put, we'll see. Because it's absolutely impossible to predict anything these days, I mean, with these tariffs. But let us still try to do that. What is the impact on Ukraine? Could be. Which, I mean, let's put it that way. Which Ukrainian industries are most likely to suffer from that new wave of patriotic tariffs?
Yeah, good question. So Ukraine actually does not export much into US at all.
Right.
There are some sort of metal exports. They import more from the US. And of course, the tariff applies only to one side. And
Right.
by the way, that formula that they used for a case like Ukraine's, a country that buys more US products than it sells into the US, you would actually end up having negative numbers, right? Because the trade balance goes in the direction that Trump prefers,
Otherwise,
in the
right.
direction of US getting to sell more. But he put a floor. So even those countries that are net buyers of US goods, they still have this the minimum 10% tariff. So that's what happened in Ukraine, is that it kind of got into this category of nice countries that buy more than they sell into the US, but even they still get a minimum 10% tariff. But what it does mean is that the impact is less because they don't sell that much into the US at all. Now, of course, there are secondary impacts, right? So if the US, for example, is buying less from Europe, right, say the automobile industries and some of those underlying
Right.
resources, right, gonna go into the production come from Ukraine, that will still be impacted. So there is kind of a downflow effect, but it is relatively smaller, of course, than the direct effects that would be felt in, for example, in the EU or China or other places. And of course, the other secondary effect is in terms of the goods that are sort of substitutes basically to US goods or to goods that US is importing from other places. So for example, if tariffs increase on US agriculture, and then here in California, that is one of the trade items that we have from our state, that can potentially, right, actually help US and Ukrainian exports in that sector. So it also depends on what the reciprocal measures taken by other countries are, and the extent to which the strengthening of trade between Ukraine and its partners who are not mutually imposing taxes on each other will
Right.
compensate for the downstream effects from the US tariffs, countries that are buying from you.
Right. You're talking about these reciprocal tariffs. Say, I know the penguins cannot do much about it, but what about Europe? Do you think that Europe should go for reciprocal tariffs and that all we should be, I say Ukraine and Europe, should be just more careful, wait out and see what happens?
Yeah, so for Ukraine, I think there's absolutely no reason to be doing anything reciprocal. As I mentioned,
Yeah,
it's a
well, that's...
small, right? I think
In Europe,
US
pardon me,
is
for
the top
Ukraine it's more or
20,
less
but not
clear, but
even
what about
top
the
10.
Europe? Right.
Yeah, for Europe, of course, it's different. They have more to lose.
Sure,
Now,
yeah.
like hundreds of billions of dollars of export into the US. And they also have maybe more levers to play, right? So also, of course, they're buying a lot more US products, and so they can have more impact. Now, as I mentioned,
Right.
some of that is things like energy that they should not be touching much because better to be buying U.S. energy than what they used to be doing, purchasing Russian energy. So I would say that for Europe, and I think that's the approach that they're planning to take, it makes sense to be very targeted, to kind of think what is politically,
Right.
right, what would be
What
the
is
items
economical?
in the
Right.
U.S. That would have the most impact, that might, right, affect workers, that might affect U.S. Factories, that would kind of make those people be like, hey, but you promised us that we're going to get more jobs, and we're instead losing jobs. It's to kind of target items that are potentially politically costly in the U.S., important industries. And in the past, that's always how I think trade tariffs have been done, including between US and EU. And you know, so certain goods get taxed more, certain goods get taxed less by those two partners, US and the European Union, depending on mostly which industry domestically they're trying to protect. Right. So, for example, EU has various policies for agriculture, for protecting their agricultural industry domestically, not just tariffs and others, but
Right.
also, right,
Right.
like program subsidies and so on. And so in the past, that it would not be like a blanket, I'm going to tax 20% on everything from some country. It would be, okay, this is a good that I want to produce domestically. For certain things, it really makes sense. If it is something very critical, right, kind of for national security that you're really worried about outsourcing and then your partner going rogue,
Yeah.
then it makes
Right.
sense
Yeah.
to kind of be more self-reliant. And so I think other countries like the EU are going to stick with that approach. Only now, instead of thinking which industry is sort of most important to us domestically, they might think which industries are important domestically in the US, where can we exert pressure by kind of targeting our tariffs a little bit more specifically. That's my expectation.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I mean, amen to that. Let's see what happens really next week. But just short last question for tonight. Why? I mean, why? All the mayhem, all the turmoil. Do you believe there is a plan?
Honestly, after seeing that formula, that's
I mean,
I'm not
exactly. The pure
convinced
algebra is just some
that there's
mathematics.
much more to it.
I mean, so what's
Yeah,
next? I
that
mean, just forget and play golf or something. I mean, but
yeah,
interesting
no, I think
times, isn't it?
this is the
And
most
very interesting
speculative
times
question
too.
of all.
I can see those faces on stock exchanges around the world. After that can make a good documentary out of it alone. But pure speculation, wasting your time. Sorry for that. Your answers were amazing. Thank you so very much. So is your expertise. I hope we do it again sometime when you have time. Thank you
Thank you
so
very
very much.
much. It was a pleasure.
Well, that was it for tonight. My name is Henry Caine, and we are UATV English, an English-speaking Ukrainian state media in a constant persuasion to deliver hard truth in easy terms for you, for the whole free world directly from Ukraine. We expect in return like, share, and comment. Please, your voice matters, as it in turn helps Ukrainian voice to be heard globally. So stay safe and see you very soon. Goodbye.